In the last week, dozens of invitations have been sent out from Wizards of the Coast to Dungeons & Dragons influencers and content creators, inviting them to attend an unprecedented, all-expenses-paid-for Dungeons & Dragons Mystery Summit. And I am really concerned, because this event has revealed a massive rift and disagreement within the content creator community about the role and ethical obligations of content creators and influencers. To be frank, I've seen some influencers recently express opinions that have made me extremely concerned about the integrity of this event. And I have noticed issues with the attitudes and behavior amongst some in the Dungeons & Dragons community, especially amongst content creators, which is really concerning me. Not only for D&D and RPGs, but for everything. Influencer marketing, content creation online, and how influencers interact with corporations and their audiences in an ethical way. And as such, I feel like I have to make this video, even though I really don't want to. So I think it's fair to say that in the last month, Wizards of the Coast have basically pulled the majority of the D&D community back into their corner of the ring to some extent. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate that there are still a lot of people who wouldn't touch the company or the game with a 10-foot pole and a dozen backup character sheets. For example, third-party creators who rely on the D&D Open Gaming license are especially reluctant to return back to D&D. These are people who have just witnessed Hasbro try and fail to essentially snuff out their livelihoods. Even if that attempted snuffing out failed, it's still not exactly a friendly gesture. It's unreasonable to initiate combat, roll for initiative, and then expect the target of the attacks to agree to a truce when you roll really badly, which is essentially what Hasbro Wizards is doing with them right now. But overall though, most people have returned to the game and are back to playing it. I do feel like there's nevertheless an underlying skepticism towards Wizards and their intentions for the role-playing game hobby in the wider D&D community that didn't exist to the same extent when compared to this time last year. And this almost cynicism from the D&D fans is also coming from D&D content creators and influencers as well, a group whose importance definitely grew over the OGL scandal. Creators like D&D Shorts were a vital outlet for leaks from Wizards of the Coast, and there was a ton of D&D creators who rallied their audience against the OGL changes that were being implemented by Hasbro. And I'm happy to say that I count myself amongst that number. Overall, there was a lot of activism from influencers that certainly shaped some of the response from D&D players. Influencers weren't the only factor, of course, but love them or hate them, they were, influential during the whole OGL thing. And this is something that Hasbro Wizards seem to have picked up on. Seriously, nothing gets past these guys. There has been a mad PR blitz from Wizards of the Coast recently. Kyle Brink, executive producer of D&D, has basically been on tour over the last few weeks, trialing the biggest collab of the century, popping up on a bunch of different YouTube channels to give interviews and generally try to reassure the community that the OGL changes were a dreadful mistake that won't be repeated. Honest. But that's not the only thing up Hasbro's big ol' wizard sleeves. Something even more controversial has rocked the community over the last week. An invite to a mystery creator summit has been extended to a number of select content creators and influencers. This is an all expenses paid for per DM trip out to Wizards of the Coast in order for those creators to ask questions, give feedback, and connect with members of the studio and content teams. No NDAs are being signed. In fact, Wizards are encouraging creators to report back on what happens at the summit to their audiences, though they have said that there are no content requirements on attendees. But of course, content has already been created about this trip, and the wider community are abuzz with the news. You've probably heard about this summit already, and there has been tons of coverage of the invitations online. But what you might not know is that this has become extremely controversial, and things have become very, very heated in the content creator space in a pretty public way. There are big questions in the community as to whether these invitations to this summit should be accepted, and what it means about those who do accept the invitation. For example, Gizmodo journalist Linda Codega, one of the first to break the D&D OGL story, has said that any influencers who are invited to the D&D summit and accept that invitation are essentially clout chasing, and the Wizards do not want real critique from people, and so have invited those that are most likely to provide positive coverage of the event. Is now a good time to mention that I wasn't invited to this summit? And these comments, these suspicions aren't only coming from Linda. There's a lot of other folk in the community who are echoing the sentiment. And this has upset a lot of, well, influencers and content creators, especially among those who have been invited. It's being called a disgustingly bad take, sour grapes from critics who are jealous that they weren't invited to the summit. And the comments like these are putting a target on the back of marginalized people. In fact, I've seen creators, including some that have been invited to the summit, claiming that they shouldn't be considered as influencers, and that their attendance at this summit will not bias their opinions of Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, and Dungeons & Dragons. And it is this specific element that has really concerned me and compelled me to make this video, because there seems to be some confusion online as to the role of content creators and influencers in the D&D community, specifically from some content creators and influencers in the D&D community, who are exactly the type of people that we do not want to be confused about all of this. And I think it's important, therefore, that we all remind ourselves of the reality of this situation and how this all works. It is not cynical to say that the desire of a corporation when dealing with influencers is uncritical praise and positivity. This is explicitly what companies want. Hype! They need it. They desire it. They hunger for it. And often, to get this hype and uncritical praise, those corporations will do things like sending out preview content or goodie boxes, or provide exclusive access to content for those influencers. The hope from a corporation is that the influencer who receives these things will then share it with their audiences and gush about how great said product is uncritically, and hype it up and praise it, convincing those in their audience to spend money on this product, and then for that influencer to then be ready and prepared for the next release to continue the marketing cycle anew. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that all influencers or content creators lose all their integrity the moment they receive review products or promotional gifts from companies, or that they are compromised by corporations by default. In fact, I would probably go so far as to say that most successful content creators aren't entirely compromised by companies because audiences aren't stupid. They can tell when someone is being disingenuous and acting as a sponsored ad. So I'm not describing the majority of content creators in the D&D community here. Likewise, I personally do not believe that all influencers are simply clout chasing as their only goal. The use of the term clout chasing is a bit of a pejorative and has a negative connotation, but most content creators, most influencers are trying to build the biggest platform that they can. But that doesn't mean that they don't have other goals as well. As the DM Lair tweeted here, you can be a content creator for reasons other than simply seeking attention. There are some of us out there who actually have principles and beliefs and a goal beyond simply growing an audience. Not me though. I'm covering D&D and miniature wargaming for all the exclusive yacht parties. I'll get my invite any minute now. Any minute. Maybe I shouldn't have said all those mean things about Hasbro. Oh, I think I messed up. But all that said, the types of gifts and products, and perhaps say all expenses paid for trips, that corporations often send to influencers and content creators do have the capacity to influence the opinions and perceptions of the recipient creators. This should not be controversial. It is a fact that is acknowledged by regulators the world over, including the FTC. Financial relationships aren't limited to money. Products, trips, dinners, dinners, whining and dining, even exclusive access, these can all be perceived as a form of payment. They have a monetary value and create a financial relationship between the giver and receiver, and 100% have the potential to create a bias. This is why, when a product is received for free, content creators and influencers are ethically and legally obligated to disclose that fact to their audience. This isn't done for fun, or for the aesthetics of the thing, or for clout. I've taken a lot of anti-corruption and anti-bribery training courses in my time when I used to work in the global financial and legal sector, and I have a personal experience of dealing with the FTC, and they are very strict on this sort of stuff. And this actually presents a bit of an issue for anyone who attends the summit, because now it introduces a question as to whether those influencers who attend have to disclose this trip during future content covering one D&D. There's an argument that they will. Their expenses are being paid per diem. This means that they are being paid to go to the summit. It's not like a games expo where you're invited to come and hope you have fun, make your own way, you're on your own. In this case, money is being exchanged from wizards to attendees. And I'm not saying that's inappropriate. I, for example, would not be able to fly across the ocean in order to attend this summit if my expenses weren't being paid for. I would not be able to visit Wizards' evil volcano base without somebody footing the bill. That's where they work, right? It's an evil volcano. It's a lair, right? I get why wizards are paying for the expenses of these influencers and creators. It makes sense. But nevertheless, influencers who attend will need to be mindful of the fact that this could create a bias, and they will have to critically evaluate all their opinions going forward and try to figure out if maybe some bias has crept in from this event. And that's something that is hard to do. It is, by definition, hard to take into account our blind spots because, you know, you can't see them. But it is something that most successful content creators will have to deal with at some stage in their career. It is part of the job. I have been paid to go to events like this for games, and I have received review product in the past as well. And I'm mindful of those things when I'm reviewing or talking about those products or games. I try to take those facts into account when I'm formulating my opinions on them, and I disclose those relevant facts and biases if I am speaking to an audience. I don't pretend like they don't have any impact on my judgment. Of course they do. This is the reality of the job, and taking these factors into account as much as possible and disclosing things that could compromise your opinions is the bare minimum requirement of being a responsible content creator online, and any creator who cannot acknowledge that cannot behave ethically in this space. And I think that broadly this is accepted in the D&D content creator community. But I have seen some people, including some who are going to this summit, argue that it will not create any bias in them at all. And that is disastrous. Of course this will bias opinions. And even worse, if someone thinks that they're free from external influence, that makes them even more vulnerable to manipulation. Did we learn nothing from the Star Wars prequels? Awareness is so important here. How can anyone claim that their opinions are not shaped by their life experiences? I've also seen people take umbrage with the fact that they're being called influencers. But these are people who have audiences and they create content. They might not be on YouTube or TikTok, but they are creating blog posts or posting on Twitter or posting on Twitch or soliciting donations from their audience or have a Patreon or simply standing on street corners yelling that D&D is the devil. I hate to break it to them, but they are influencers. They are wielding influence over their audience's opinions on things. I'm sorry that some people seem to take exception to being called an influencer, but it is this complete lack of awareness about the obligations of influencers that is partially responsible for the title influencer now being used very often as a pejorative. It gives truth to the caricature that many online influencers simply have no comprehension of the power of their platforms and are willing to sell out their audience for money or access because they don't understand the value or importance of those things. They don't understand their obligations. And I'm not saying that people going to the summit are going to do that. that. I absolutely believe that most are going with good intent and fairness and will continue to be critical. But I do also think that this is entirely a PR event that will result in good press for Wizards of the Coast. It might also result in some performative, insubstantial changes, but ultimately attending it gives Wizards a win, allowing them to appear like they're taking on community feedback without having to really act on it. And that ultimately, one of the simplest ways to figure out what the goal of this entire enterprise is to look at what department's budget all these costs will likely come from. The marketing budget. And I hope I'm wrong about Wizards' intentions here. I really do, but man, Wizards really did play their hand a little strong during the UGL scandal. And it's going to take a whole lot for me, at least, not to see their actions in a pretty skeptical light. And to be honest, while there have been big creators invited to this event like Nerd Immersion and Bob the World Builder, a lot of those who have been invited are smaller content creators. And smaller content creators have a lot more to gain from events like this, and a lot more to lose as well. And this means that they will need to do more work to not be biased. And I say that as a smaller content creator. I'm sorry, but it's just the reality of the situation. Ultimately, if you accept something from a corporation, you will be scrutinized, especially outside your immediate audience. And that's not bad. We should view these events with both eyes open and pretty cautiously, because I think that the reasons for this summit are pretty obvious. Overall, Hasbro just they need some good press, especially as we get closer to the launch of 1D&D. This is a particularly vulnerable time for Dungeons & Dragons. I don't think it was Wizards' plan to divide the community and cause a ton of drama between content creators or to undermine any specific individuals, except maybe those who weren't invited, like D&D shorts. It's more likely that Wizards have realized that they have an entire ecosystem of content creators in the TTRPG hobby that they have not quite actioned or tapped into adequately. Not only to use as an element of their PR revival, but also to help them get a pulse on the desires of the wider D&D community. The leaks that we've seen over the last few months have revealed that the executives at Hasbro Wizards didn't realize how poignant an issue the OGL was going to be with players. And the reason for that is, well, they don't understand the game or community. But Hasbro Wizards are very aware of the fact that the launch of a new edition of a game is one of the most important, most risky, most vulnerable moments in a new edition's lifespan. They're going to have to work extremely hard to onboard players into this entirely new 1D&D system. One that is radically different from other versions of Dungeons & Dragons. Perhaps not in game mechanics, but in how it is distributed and engaged with by players. This will necessitate good press and a better comprehension of the feeling of the D&D community, and a lot of goodwill from players. Because actually, this has all happened before, and it didn't work out for Hasbro last time. They totally misstepped, and the community abandoned Dungeons & Dragons. It was actually an existential crisis for the game. D&D almost died. It lost its central position in the market, and Hasbro doesn't want that to happen again. And if you're curious about how it all went down last time, then check out my video on when Hasbro tried to turn D&D into a virtual tabletop game 15 years ago, and how it all went wrong here. And a huge thanks to all my patrons, especially Sonic Bread and Crypto Kev. And of course to all my patrons who support this channel and allowing me to create independent, critical content like this. My goal in the community is to provide coverage with integrity and independently. And the support of patrons allows me to do that. So thanks, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye!